White woman calls police on black teen, speechless, when his mom arrives and she's the mayor. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more amazing content. Elliot leaned against the base of an old oak tree in Lincoln Park, his favorite spot to relax after school. The golden sunlight filtered through the leaves, warming his face as he closed his eyes. The scent of freshly cut grass and blooming flowers filled the air, a familiar and comforting backdrop to the quietness of the park. His mom had texted him earlier, promising to pick him up soon. For now, he was content to wait, lost in his thoughts. But a strange sensation prickled at the back of his neck. Elliot opened his eyes, scanning the park with a slight frown. Across the way, a middle-aged woman in a light blue cardigan was staring at him. Her lips were pressed into a thin, disapproving line, and her sharp gaze made his skin crawl. Elliot glanced around, hoping she was looking at something, or someone else. But no, her attention was fixed squarely on him. He looked away, trying to shake the uneasy feeling, but the woman, later known to him as Margaret, stood abruptly from the bench. Her movements were stiff, her jaw set with determination as she walked toward him. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her tone sharp and accusing. Elliot blinked, confused by her hostility. "I'm just waiting for my mom," he replied, his voice calm despite the knot forming in his stomach. "This is a family park," she snapped. "Not a place for kids like you to hang around causing trouble. You need to leave." The accusation hit like a slap. Elliot's chest tightened as a mix of confusion, frustration, and disbelief swirled inside him. He stood, brushing grass from his jeans. "I'm not causing trouble," he said evenly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I have every right to be here." Margaret's expression darkened, and her hand darted into her purse. Elliot froze, dread curling in his gut as she pulled out her phone. "Ma'am," he said, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "There's no need to call anyone. I'm just waiting for my mom. She'll be here any minute." But Margaret's resolve was clear. She punched in the numbers with trembling fingers, her eyes never leaving him. "Hello," she said into the phone, her voice cutting through the park's quiet. "I'd like to report a suspicious teenager in Lincoln Park." "Yes, he's loitering and refusing to leave." Elliot stood rooted to the spot, a cold wave of fear washing over him. He wasn't just nervous, he was terrified. His mind raced as the reality of the situation settled in. He had done nothing wrong, but he knew how little that mattered. He'd seen the news, heard the stories. "Please, don't do this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm not doing anything. My mom's on her way." Margaret ignored him, her description of him to the dispatcher growing more exaggerated with each passing second. Elliot's heart pounded as he glanced around the park. It was mostly empty, save for a jogger in the distance and a couple walking their dog on the far end. No one seemed to notice or care what was happening. As Margaret continued her call, Elliot clenched his fists at his sides, trying to steady his breathing. His mother had always warned him to stay calm, to avoid sudden movements, to never escalate a situation. He prayed she would arrive before the situation spiraled out of control. Margaret's voice carried through the park as she continued her call with the 911 dispatcher, describing Elliot with words that made him feel like he was suddenly a threat rather than a kid waiting for his mom. "A teenager," she said, her tone growing more certain with each word. "About 14 or 15. Black hoodie, jeans. He's been here for hours, just loitering. It's making people uncomfortable. Please, send someone quickly." Elliot couldn't believe what he was hearing. Hours? He'd been there maybe 20 minutes. And who was she talking about when she said people? There was barely anyone else around. "Ma'am," Elliot interrupted, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his fear. "You're making a mistake. I don't want any trouble. My mom is coming. Please just wait." Margaret turned her back to him slightly, as if to shield herself, her phone pressed tightly to her ear. "Yes, he's acting aggressive now," she said, her words sending a sharp pang of dread through Elliot. "I think he's about to run." Elliot froze, his hand still raised slightly, his chest tight. "Run." He hadn't moved an inch. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, and his mind reeled. He thought of his mother's words, her lessons drilled into him from the time he was little. Keep your hands visible. Stay calm. Don't argue. Don't make them feel threatened. As his heart pounded in his ears, Elliot's legs felt heavy, like they were rooted to the ground. He couldn't move even if he wanted to. His fear was a physical thing now, cold and suffocating. And then he heard it, the distant sound of sirens. His stomach dropped. The sound grew louder, the rising wail of police cars, piercing the stillness of the park. Elliot glanced down at his trembling hands, trying to steady them. He'd done nothing wrong. He had every right to be here. But none of that mattered now. When the two police cruisers pulled up, tires screeching slightly as they came to a stop, Elliot felt every muscle in his body tense. Blue and red lights flashed across the trees, painting the peaceful park in sudden chaos. Two officers stepped out of their vehicles, their faces unreadable as they surveyed the scene. They moved deliberately, their hands resting near their belts as they approached. "What seems to be the problem here?" one of them asked, his voice calm but firm. Margaret stepped forward, her face a mask of concern that Elliot couldn't believe was real. "This young man has been hanging around here for hours," she said quickly, her voice trembling slightly for effect. "He refused to leave when I asked. I was worried for the families in the park." The taller officer nodded, his gaze flickering to Elliot. His expression was neutral, but there was a sharpness in his eyes that made Elliot feel small, insignificant. "Stay right there," the other officer said to Elliot, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elliot swallowed hard, forcing himself to keep still as they turned back to Margaret. She launched into an exaggerated recounting of the last 10 minutes, her words twisting reality until Elliot barely recognized the story she was telling. "He seemed agitated when I asked what he was doing," she said, glancing briefly at Elliot as if to confirm her own version of events. "I didn't know what he might do." Elliot wanted to speak up, to shout that it wasn't true, but the way the officers nodded and scribbled notes made his stomach churn. He could feel the story slipping further from his control. When the officers finally turned back to him, their stances were rigid, their expressions unreadable. "All right, son," the taller one said, his voice clipped. "Why don't you tell us what you're doing here?" Elliot took a shaky breath, his mouth dry. "I'm just waiting for my mom to pick me up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's gaze didn't soften. "Do you have any ID on you?" "I'm 14, Elliot said quietly. "I don't have a driver's license or anything." The second officer folded his arms. "Then how are we supposed to know who you are?" Elliot felt his face flush, his chest tightening even more. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. The pressure of their stares, Margaret's smug presence, and the swirling fear in his mind made it impossible to think. As the officers continued their questioning, their tone growing sharper with each exchange, Elliot's world shrank. A small crowd had started to gather at the edge of the park, their murmurs barely audible over the pounding in his ears. A few people had their phones out, filming the scene. Elliot's shoulders slumped as humiliation burned in his chest. He felt the weight of their stares, their judgment, and the knowledge that this moment might live on the internet forever. And still, he could do nothing but wait. Elliot's heart thudded loudly in his chest as the questioning dragged on. The officers' eyes remained sharp, unyielding, their clipped tones making it clear they weren't buying his explanation. "I told you," Elliot said, his voice trembling as he tried to sound steady. "I was just sitting here, waiting for my mom. She's on her way." One officer tilted his head, skeptical. "You expect us to take your word for it? You don't have ID, and you're out here alone. What do you think that looks like?" "It looks like nothing," Elliot replied, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The other officer stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holstered weapon. "Watch your tone, kid," he said firmly. "We're trying to sort this out, but you're not making it easy." Elliot's breath hitched as he stepped back instinctively, his hands twitching at his sides. He knew he couldn't let his emotions show. Not too much. Not here. The crowd that had gathered grew larger, the tension in the air crackling like static. Phones were raised, their cameras recording everything. Elliot felt their eyes on him, the weight of their attention pressing heavily against his shoulders. Margaret stood off to the side, her arms crossed, her face smug as though this was all playing out exactly as she'd planned. "I told you," she said, cutting into the conversation. "He's been hanging around here for hours. I'm just trying to keep this park safe for families." Elliot turned his head sharply, disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "That's not true," he said, louder than he intended. "You don't even know me. I've been here maybe 20 minutes, and I haven't done anything." The taller officer raised a hand, his expression hardening. "Enough." Elliot froze, swallowing hard as he looked down at the ground, his fists clenched. The frustration burned hot inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to stay still. "Look," Margaret said, addressing the officers now. "I don't know what his deal is, but he wouldn't leave when I asked. He's clearly up to no good." Elliot's jaw tightened, his chest heaving with the effort of holding back his words. He wanted to shout, to demand to know why she assumed he didn't belong here. But he knew it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't change her mind. One of the officers turned to Margaret, nodding slightly. "Thanks for your concern, ma'am. We'll handle it from here." Margaret smiled tightly, stepping back, but still hovering near enough to watch the scene unfold. The second officer turned back to Elliot, his tone as cold as his stare. "You said your mom's on her way. Where is she? We've been standing here for a while now." "She's coming," Elliot said, his voice quieter now. "She's probably stuck in traffic or something. Please, just wait a little longer." The officer didn't respond immediately, his gaze shifting to his partner. The two exchanged a glance, one Elliot couldn't read, but that made his stomach churn. "Let's call her," the taller officer finally said, pulling a notepad from his pocket. "You got her number?" Elliot nodded quickly, rattling off the digits. The officer punched them into his phone, stepping a few feet away as he made the call. Elliot stood there, his chest tight, his breath shallow. He felt trapped in the moment, every second dragging on like an hour. The officer spoke quietly into the phone, his back turned, while the other kept his eyes firmly on Elliot, watching him like a hawk. The low rumble of an engine in the distance pulled Elliot's attention. He turned his head, his heart jumping as a sleek black SUV came into view, pulling into the park's small lot. Relief washed over him, though it did little to calm his frayed nerves. As the SUV came to a stop, the officer on the phone froze mid-sentence. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but Elliot noticed it. The flicker of recognition, the way his posture straightened. The door of the SUV opened, and a tall woman in a fitted blazer stepped out, her presence commanding. Her face was a mix of anger and restraint, her sharp eyes scanning the scene before landing on Elliot. "Mom," Elliot whispered, his voice barely audible. Angela Morris, the mayor of the city, stepped forward with a deliberate calm that made the tension in the park feel even heavier. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Elliot watched as the officers seemed to straighten unconsciously, their earlier confidence replaced with something closer to unease. Angela's voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd, quiet but steely. "What's going on here?" The taller officer cleared his throat, his hesitation obvious. "Ma'am," he began, his tone formal now, "we received a report about a suspicious individual in the park. We were just—" Angela held up a hand, silencing him. Her sharp gaze turned to Margaret, who was suddenly less sure of herself. "You," Angela said, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "You called this in?" Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish, her earlier confidence crumbling under Angela's scrutiny. I just thought he looked suspicious," she stammered. "I didn't realize." Angela's eyes narrowed. "You didn't realize what? That he's my son? Or that your unfounded assumptions could have led to something far worse?" Margaret flushed a deep red, her gaze dropping to the ground. The crowd, now buzzing with whispers, seemed to lean in, hanging on every word. Elliot watched his mother, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. She was here now, and he knew she wouldn't let this go unanswered. Angela's sharp gaze swept across the scene, taking in every detail. The flashing police lights, the growing crowd, the officers standing stiffly, and her son, Elliot, still rooted to the spot. Her hands clenched at her sides, but her voice was measured, her control absolute. "Explain to me," she said, her tone cutting through the murmurs of the onlookers, "why my son is being treated like a suspect in a public park." The officers exchanged an uneasy glance, their earlier confidence replaced with hesitation. The taller one cleared his throat again, attempting to maintain his composure. "Ma'am," he began, his voice careful, "we received a call from this woman." He gestured toward Margaret, reporting a suspicious individual. "We arrived and found your son here. We were simply following up." Angela's eyebrows lifted, and her expression hardened. "Following up," she repeated, her voice razor-sharp. "Following up on what? Sitting on the grass? Waiting for his mother? Is that what passes as suspicious behavior these days?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably, the smugness she had displayed earlier now replaced with visible unease. I didn't know he was your son," she said quickly, her voice trembling. Angela turned her full attention to Margaret, and the woman visibly wilted under her stare. "And why?" Angela asked, her voice deceptively calm. "Should it matter whose son he is? Why does he have to be my son for you to realize that your actions were unjustified?" Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of the question seemed to hang in the air, settling over everyone present. Angela took a step closer to her son, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. Elliot felt the tension in his body ease slightly under her touch, though his hands were still trembling. "Elliot," Angela said softly, her voice dropping into a gentler register. "Are you okay?" Elliot nodded slowly, his voice quiet but steady. "I'm fine, Mom. Just shaken up." Angela's jaw tightened, but she nodded. She turned back to the officers, her sharp tone returning. "Do you see the problem here?" she asked, her words directed at both of them. "Do you understand the message you're sending when you treat a child? Because that's what he is, a child, as though he's a criminal based on nothing but someone's baseless assumptions." The officers remained silent, their earlier authority fading in the face of her questions. Angela's gaze flicked to Margaret, who looked as though she wished the ground would swallow her whole. "And you," Angela said, her words steady but cutting. "Do you have any idea what could have happened? How this could have escalated?" Margaret stammered, I was just trying to keep the park safe. I didn't mean any harm. No harm." Angela's voice rose slightly, her frustration evident now. "Do you think Elliot feels no harm was done? Do you think I feel that way? You weaponized a system against an innocent boy because of your own biases, and you want to pretend there's no harm." Margaret's face flushed deeply, and she looked away, unable to meet Angela's eyes. The crowd was silent now, all eyes on the mayor. Even those who had initially been skeptical seemed to hang on her every word. Angela let out a slow breath, visibly reining in her emotions. She turned back to the officers, her tone firm. "Gentlemen, I expect a full report on this incident, and I don't want excuses. I want accountability." The taller officer nodded stiffly. "Yes, ma'am. Of course." Angela nodded curtly before turning her attention back to the crowd. She addressed them directly, her voice carrying with the authority of her position and the passion of a mother protecting her child. "This incident is a stark reminder of the work we still have to do," she said, her eyes scanning the faces of those gathered. "Racial bias isn't just a concept. It's not something abstract. It's real, and it affects real people. Children like my son, who was treated as a threat for simply existing in a public space." Elliot glanced at his mom, a flicker of pride breaking through the lingering fear in his chest. He had seen her address crowds before, but never with this level of raw emotion. Angela continued, "We cannot build a community rooted in fear and division. We must confront our biases, every single one of us, and work together to ensure that no one else has to endure what my son just went through." Her words hung in the air, sinking into the hearts of everyone listening. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked down, their expressions thoughtful, even ashamed. Angela looked back at Elliot, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go home. Elliot nodded, falling into step beside her as they made their way to the SUV. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but for the first time since the ordeal began, he didn't feel small. As Angela opened the car door for him, she turned back to the officers one last time. "I'll be following up on this personally," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt. With that, she climbed into the driver's seat, and the black SUV pulled away, leaving behind a park full of people who had much to reflect on. The drive home was quiet at first. Elliot stared out the window, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The flashing lights, the accusing stares, the way his every word seemed to be doubted. It all replayed in his head like a bad dream. Angela glanced at him from the driver's seat, her jaw still tight with anger. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay. But she also knew that he needed a moment to process. Finally, she broke the silence. "Elliot," she said softly, her voice steady but laced with concern. "Talk to me. How are you feeling?" Elliot didn't answer right away. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a shaky breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "Angry, I guess. And scared, but mostly tired." Angela's hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "You shouldn't have to feel this way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for sitting in a park. Not for being who you are." Elliot turned to look at her, his eyes heavy with frustration. "But I do, don't I? No matter what I do, people like her are always going to see me as a threat." Angela exhaled deeply, the weight of his words settling over her. "It's not fair," she said firmly. "And it's not right. But that's why we keep fighting. That's why I do what I do, Elliot, for you and every kid like you. So maybe, one day, you won't have to carry this." Elliot nodded slowly, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mom. Underscore 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 underscore. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Videos of the incident at the park had flooded social media, sparking heated debates in comment sections and local news outlets. Angela's confrontation with Margaret and the officers had struck a nerve, forcing the city to confront its uncomfortable truths about bias and systemic racism. Some praised Angela for standing up for her son, while others criticized her for what they called grandstanding. Elliot avoided the headlines, but the buzz was impossible to ignore. At school, his classmates whispered as he walked through the hallways. A few stopped him to ask if he was okay, their voices tinged with curiosity and concern. Others avoided his gaze entirely, as if unsure of how to approach him after what had happened. In the cafeteria, his best friend, Jordan, slid into the seat across from him. "So, you went viral," Jordan said, his tone awkward but warm. Elliot rolled his eyes. "Yeah, great. Just what I needed." Jordan smirked. "I mean, at least your mom roasted that lady. That was awesome." Elliot couldn't help but laugh, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "Yeah," he said, a small smile creeping onto his face. "She doesn't mess around." Underscore 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 underscore. Meanwhile, Angela was at City Hall, preparing to address the growing media attention. She stood at the podium in the press room, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions. "Mayor Morris," one reporter called, her voice cutting through the noise. "Do you believe the actions of the officers were racially motivated?" Angela took a moment to compose herself before answering. "What I believe," she said firmly, "is that bias, whether conscious or unconscious, played a role in how my son was treated. And that bias is something we must address, not just in our police force, but in every aspect of our community." Another reporter chimed in. What steps are you taking to prevent incidents like this in the future? Angela straightened, her resolve clear. Effective immediately, I am implementing mandatory anti-bias training for all city employees, including our police officers. This training will be comprehensive and ongoing, designed to help us recognize and challenge the biases we all carry. Her words sparked murmurs in the room, some skeptical, others supportive. Angela continued, her voice unwavering. This is not about blaming individuals. It's about creating a culture of accountability and understanding. We owe that to every person in this city. Underscore 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 underscore. Back at home, Elliot was scrolling through his phone when he came across one of the videos from the park. He hesitated before pressing play, unsure if he wanted to relive the moment. But as the video played, something shifted inside him. He saw himself standing there, scared but steady, his hands visible, his voice calm. He saw his mom arrive, her presence commanding, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. And he saw the crowd, their faces a mix of shock, shame, and realization. For the first time, Elliot didn't just feel like the victim of a bad situation. He felt like a part of something bigger, a moment that might actually make people stop and think. He sent the video to his mom with a short message. "Thank you for standing up for me." Her reply came almost instantly, always. The incident at the park was no longer just a moment between Elliot, Angela, Margaret, and the police. It had become a flashpoint for the entire community. Conversations erupted across Lincoln City, from dinner tables to classrooms, with people debating what had happened and what it meant. At City Hall, Angela stood firm in her resolve to implement changes. The anti-bias training she announced was just the beginning, but it faced pushback almost immediately. "I understand your frustration," Angela said during a heated city council meeting, addressing one of her colleagues who argued against the program. "But let me be clear, this is not optional. If we ignore the role bias plays in our systems, we're complicit in the harm it causes. And I won't allow that. Not in this city." Her words were met with scattered applause from members of the public who had come to watch the proceedings. Angela caught a glimpse of Elliot sitting in the audience, his quiet presence grounding her as she fought to push through the resistance. Meanwhile, the video of the park incident continued to spread online, garnering both support and criticism. Some people called Angela a hero for defending her son and taking a stand against systemic racism. Others accused her of using the situation for political gain. Elliot tried to ignore the noise, but it was hard not to be affected by the comments. He scrolled through them late at night, his stomach twisting at the vitriol in some of the responses. Why didn't the kid just leave if he wasn't doing anything wrong? Typical mayor, making everything about race. This kid will grow up thinking the rules don't apply to him because his mom bailed him out. But then there were the messages that kept him going. "Thank you for sharing this. People need to see how these things happen. You're so brave, Elliot. Keep your head up. I showed this to my kids as an example of why we need to be better." Elliot sighed, closing the app. He felt like he was carrying the weight of two worlds, the one that saw him as a threat and the one that saw him as a symbol. He wasn't sure which was heavier. At school, the buzz around him hadn't died down. Teachers avoided bringing up the incident directly, but Elliot could feel their watchful eyes, their careful words. Some students were supportive, asking how he was holding up. Others kept their distance, unsure of what to say. But there was one moment that surprised him. After debate club one afternoon, his classmate Rachel, a quiet girl who rarely spoke unless it was to make a point, approached him. "Hey," she said, her voice tentative. "Hey," Elliot replied, bracing himself for another round of awkward questions. But Rachel didn't ask about the video or his mom. Instead, she said, "That must have been scary. I'm sorry you had to go through that." Elliot blinked, caught off guard by her sincerity. "Thanks," he said after a moment. It was scary." Rachel nodded, then added, "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. I mean, not that you have to or anything. Just yeah." Elliot smiled for what felt like the first time that day. Thanks, Rachel. That means a lot. Underscore 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 underscore. Angela's days were consumed by meetings, press conferences, and planning sessions. The anti-bias training program was moving forward, and she was already in talks with community leaders to organize town halls about racial equity. But no matter how busy she was, she always made time for Elliot. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching TV, Angela glanced at her son. "You've been quiet," she said, her tone gentle. Elliot shrugged. "Just thinking. About." He hesitated, then said, "Do you think anything's really going to change? Like, will all this actually make a difference?" Angela paused, considering her answer carefully. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said finally. "And it doesn't happen without resistance. But moments like this, they plant seeds. They make people stop and think. That's how it starts." Elliot nodded, though he still looked unsure. Angela reached over, taking his hand. "You've been so strong through all of this. Don't underestimate the impact of your voice, Elliot. You're part of this change, whether you realize it or not." Elliot squeezed her hand, a small but genuine smile breaking through. "Thanks, Mom." Underscore 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 underscore. The video, the news coverage, the community conversations, they all felt overwhelming at times. But as Elliot watched the small ripples of change begin to form, he realized something. This wasn't just about him. It was bigger than one incident in a park. It was about creating a future where kids like him didn't have to feel scared or small for existing in public spaces. And for the first time, Elliot felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, that future was possible. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. Angela's anti-bias training program was officially approved, despite the pushback from certain corners of the city council. The first sessions began with a mix of skepticism and genuine interest, but Angela remained steadfast. "This isn't just a policy," she told the officers and city employees during the first training session. "This is about building trust. It's about ensuring that every resident of this city feels seen, valued, and safe. Change starts here, with all of us." Her words resonated, sparking discussions that extended far beyond the training rooms. Town halls filled with residents eager to share their stories, their fears, and their hopes for a more just community. Angela attended each one, listening intently and making notes, determined to keep the momentum going. Meanwhile, Elliot was navigating his own version of change. At school, he joined discussions about race and bias during history class, his voice steady and sure as he shared his perspective. "I'm not just a headline," he said one day when a teacher asked how the park incident had affected him. "I'm a kid. I want to hang out with my friends, play basketball, and just exist without feeling like I don't belong." That's not asking for much. His classmates listened, some nodding in agreement, others fidgeting uncomfortably. But Elliot didn't shy away. He realized his story was a tool, a way to make others see what they might have missed before. Underscore 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 underscore. One Saturday morning, Angela and Elliot returned to Lincoln Park for the first time since the incident. The air was crisp, the sunlight filtering through the trees in the same way it had that day. Elliot hesitated as they approached the spot where everything had unfolded. The memories rushed back. The flashing lights, Margaret's accusing voice, the officer's sharp gazes. Angela noticed him slowing down and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," she said gently. Elliot took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the familiar scene. I'm ready, he said, his voice firm. They walked together to the oak tree where Elliot had been sitting weeks ago. A few joggers passed by, and a group of kids played tag near the swings. Everything looked normal, but it felt different, lighter somehow. Elliot sat down on the grass, leaning against the tree like he had before. Angela joined him, resting her back against the trunk. Feels strange being here again, Elliot admitted after a while. Strange how? Angela asked. Like it's the same park. But it's not, he said, searching for the right words. It's like everything that happened that day is still here, but it doesn't feel as heavy anymore. Angela nodded, understanding what he meant. That's the power of facing things head on, she said. You take the weight and turn it into something you can carry. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the park come to life around them. As they left the park, a woman approached them hesitantly. Elliot recognized her immediately, Margaret. She looked different now, her usually composed demeanor replaced with something softer, more unsure. Mayor Morris, she said, her voice quiet, almost shaky. Elliot. Angela's expression hardened slightly, but she nodded for Margaret to continue. I wanted to apologize, Margaret said, her eyes darting nervously between them. For what I did, for what I assumed. I didn't see it then, but I see it now, and I'm sorry. Elliot stared at her, unsure of what to say. He hadn't expected this. Not from her. Angela spoke first, her tone measured. Acknowledging the harm you caused is a start, Margaret, but apologies alone don't fix what's broken. Margaret nodded, her face flushing. I know. That's why I've started volunteering with the Anti-Bias Initiative. I want to do better, to be better. Elliot glanced at his mom, who gave him a small nod, letting him decide how to respond. Thank you, Elliot said finally, his voice steady. I hope you mean it. I do, Margaret said earnestly. She hesitated for a moment before adding, and I hope one day I can earn back some of the trust I've broken. Elliot didn't reply, but he gave her a small nod before turning to leave with his mom. Underscore 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 underscore. As they walked back to the car, Elliot glanced at Angela. Do you think she'll actually change? Angela smiled faintly. That's up to her. But you did your part, Elliot. You made her see what she didn't before. That's more than most people ever get to do. Elliot nodded, his steps feeling a little lighter. Underscore 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 underscore. In the weeks and months that followed, the city continued to grapple with the lessons of that day in the park. The training sessions expanded, new community programs were launched, and conversations about race and bias became part of the city's fabric. Elliot, too, found himself growing in ways he hadn't expected. He joined the Student Equity Council at school, working with classmates to create a more inclusive environment. He shared his story when asked, but also listened, really listened, to others' experiences. And through it all, Angela stood by him, proud of the young man he was becoming. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Elliot turned to his mom. Do you think things will ever be different? Like really different? Angela smiled, her eyes reflecting the golden light of the horizon. I think change is slow, she said thoughtfully. But every step we take brings us closer. And you, Elliot, you're one of those steps. Elliot leaned back in his chair, a sense of calm washing over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't just carrying the weight of the world. He was helping to shape it.